The victim was Margaret Henley, 23 years old, daughter of the late Dr. Henley and stepdaughter to Mrs. Venetia Henley, who now lived in the most prominent residence on the village's western edge. Margaret had been found lying at the base of the brick well, her neck bearing the unmistakable signs of violent strangulation. Her pale blue eyes stared upward at the sky with the fixed, unseeing quality that death imparts. There was no obvious weapon, no signs of struggle beyond the terrible marks upon her throat. She had been wearing a cream-colored dress, now crumpled and soiled, and one of her shoes lay several feet distant, as though she had kicked it free in her final moments of consciousness. Detective Inspector Gravely established himself in the village hall with the efficiency of a military campaign. A young constable was dispatched to London for the fingerprint experts and police photographers, though Gravely seemed to be working under the assumption that the case would be resolved long before their arrival. He interviewed Clara Ashworth first, naturally, being the person who had discovered the body. Clara, sitting in the village hall with her hands twisted nervously in her lap, explained that she had gone for a walk to clear her head before the Fete Queen ceremony. The path to the brick well was a favorite route of hers, she said, and she had been distressed to find her friend in such circumstances. Friend. The word hung in the air like a question mark. Miss Marple, who sat quietly in the corner of the hall, no one had thought to exclude her, and she had simply taken a seat as though by right. Noted that Clara's jaw tightened fractionally when she said this. Not quite a lie, then, but not quite the full truth either. There was history between these two young women, Miss Marple sensed, of the sort that village girls accumulated the way their mothers accumulated recipes, carefully, jealously, and with considerable emotional investment. By evening, the investigation had begun to assume a particular shape. Margaret Henley had been last seen alive at approximately 2 o'clock, when she had taken tea with her stepmother at their home. Venetia Henley, a woman in her mid-50s with the sort of rigid posture that suggested a lifetime of maintaining propriety, confirmed this in a composed voice that wavered only slightly when describing her stepdaughter. Margaret had been dressed for the fete, Venetia explained, but had suddenly claimed a headache and decided not to attend. This had surprised her, as Margaret had been excited about the festivities only an hour prior. What had changed in that hour? This was the question that Detective Inspector Gravely pursued with increasing frustration. Margaret's room revealed nothing unusual, no suicide note, no signs of distress. Her handbag contained the ordinary items of a young woman's life, a handkerchief, a compact, a small purse containing £3 and sixpence, and a letter from a friend, in London, discussing nothing more sinister than a new hat shop on Oxford Street. The village, meanwhile, had begun its own investigation with the enthusiasm of those freed from the constraint of propriety by the presence of actual tragedy. In the kitchens and parlors of Thornfield, theories multiplied like rabbits. Margaret had been involved with a soldier, someone said. No, a farmer's son, insisted another. She had been rejected by someone important, claimed a third voice, and love had turned to despair. By evening, at least 6 different murder theories were circulating, each more elaborate and speculative than the last. Miss Marple moved through this tide of speculation with her knitting needles clicking steadily. She had positioned herself strategically in various locations, the post office, the church, Mrs. Pemberton's drawing room, and listened with the devoted attention of someone genuinely interested in the human condition. She observed that certain names came up repeatedly in conversations about Margaret. There was the vicar's son, Timothy, who had taken Margaret to the Easter dance but had apparently discontinued their acquaintance quite suddenly. There was Robert Ashworth, Clara's older brother, who owned a substantial piece of land adjoining the Henley property and who had, according to village gossip, assisted Dr. Henley with various improvements to his estate before Dr. Henley's death 2 years prior. And then there was the matter of Mrs. Venetia Henley herself. The widow had come into the Henley fortune upon her husband's death, which had been quite sudden. A heart attack, everyone said, perfectly unexpected. Dr. Henley's will had been rather surprising to some, leaving his considerable estate not to Margaret directly but in trust, with Venetia as trustee until Margaret reached 25. Margaret would have inherited full control in 2 years' time. This arrangement had seemed reasonable enough at the time, though Miss Marple had noted, when she learned of it at a church coffee morning some 18 months ago, that the solicitor's wife had exchanged a rather loaded glance with the bank manager's wife when this detail was mentioned. It was now nearly 9 o'clock in the evening, and Detective Inspector Gravely had announced that he would conduct formal interviews beginning at 10 o'clock the following morning. The village of Thornfield, so recently festive and carefree, settled into an uneasy night, knowing that one of their number was a murderer. Miss Marple returned to her small cottage on the village outskirts, made herself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat in her favorite armchair with her knitting. She had observed something during the day that troubled her, a small inconsistency that seemed almost trivial in isolation, but which nagged at her like a persistent itch. Tomorrow, she thought, she would see whether her instincts served her as reliably as they had in the past. The morning of Margaret Henley's formal inquiry dawned grey and uncertain, with clouds gathering above Thornfield as though the heavens themselves were unsettled by the violence that had disturbed the village peace. Detective Inspector Gravely had commandeered not only the village hall, but also the vicar's private study, creating what amounted to a miniature courthouse within the familiar confines of St. Mary's Church. By 9 o'clock, a queue of villagers had formed outside, each waiting to be called in for questioning, each nursing their own mixture of anxiety and morbid curiosity. Miss Marple arrived at the church at 9:30, carrying her knitting bag and moving with the unhurried pace of someone for whom time held fewer terrors than it did for younger people. The vicar's wife, Mrs. Pemberton, was organizing the tea station in the vestry, though her hands shook slightly as she arranged the cups. She greeted Miss Marple with evident relief, as though the older woman's presence alone provided some measure of reassurance. "Dreadful, simply dreadful," Mrs. Pemberton murmured, pressing a cup of tea into Miss Marple's hands. Poor Margaret, whatever could have prompted such a terrible act? And by someone in our village, no less. It hardly bears thinking about. Miss Marple accepted the tea with her customary grace and settled into a chair positioned conveniently near the vestry doorway. From this vantage point, she could observe the comings and goings of those summoned for interview, could catch fragments of conversation, could note the subtle shifts in demeanor that accompanied proximity to official scrutiny. It was from here that she first observed the peculiar behavior of Robert Ashworth. Robert emerged from the vicar's study at approximately 10:45, his face flushed with what might have been anger, or might have been fear. Miss Marple had learned that these two emotions often produced remarkably similar physical manifestations. He passed through the vestry without acknowledging anyone present, though his eyes swept across the gathered villagers with a quality of desperate assessment, as though he were counting them, measuring them, determining whether anyone had observed his interview. Clara Ashworth was called in shortly thereafter, and her interview lasted considerably longer than her brother's, nearly 50 minutes. When she emerged, her eyes were red-rimmed, though whether from tears or from the emotional strain of interrogation, Miss Marple could not definitively determine. Clara made directly for the tea station and poured herself a cup with trembling hands, spilling perhaps a quarter of it into the saucer. Her mother, who had been sitting anxiously near the window, rose to comfort her, but Clara waved her away with an abruptness that suggested emotional turmoil of considerable magnitude. By midday, Mrs. Venetia Henley had been interviewed for 2 full hours. This, in itself, was noteworthy. While other suspects had been questioned for 30 to 45 minutes, Gravely seemed intent on extracting every possible detail from Margaret's stepmother. When Venetia finally emerged, she moved with the careful precision of someone who had been holding herself together through sheer force of will. Her hair, usually perfectly arranged, had loosened somewhat, and there was a slight tremor in her hands as she accepted a cup of tea from Mrs. Pemberton. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple made her first conscious intervention. She rose from her chair and approached Mrs. Henley with the gentle solicitude that had characterized her interactions with the village's troubled souls for decades. "You look quite exhausted, dear," Miss Marple observed, settling beside Venetia with a casualness that suggested nothing more than friendly concern. "These matters are so draining, are they not? I remember when young Thomas Wickham was accused of poaching on Lord Ashford's estate. Oh, this was 30 years ago or more, and the questioning went on for hours. His mother was quite distraught." Venetia turned to look at Miss Marple with eyes that held something approaching desperation. For a moment, it seemed she might say something of considerable importance, but then she appeared to reconsider. She took a sip of her tea instead, the cup rattling faintly against the saucer. "The inspector seems to believe that financial matters were involved," Venetia said quietly, after a long pause. "He has been asking about Margaret's inheritance, about the trust, about what would happen to the estate now that she is dead." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully. "How very practical of him," she observed. "Though I confess I've always found that the most apparent motives are often the least reliable. People commit terrible acts for reasons that would seem utterly insufficient to a rational observer. A thoughtless remark made years ago, a perceived slight at a social gathering, a moment of wounded pride. These things burrow into the human heart and grow into something monstrous." Venetia was studying Miss Marple with renewed interest now, as though seeing the elderly woman for the first time. "You seem to understand a great deal about such matters," she said. "Oh, I've lived a very long time in a very small place," Miss Marple replied with characteristic modesty. "One observes a good deal, whether one wishes to or not. But tell me, Mrs. Henley, was there anything unusual about Margaret's behavior in recent weeks? Anything that struck you as odd or out of character?" Venetia's hands tightened around her teacup. "She seemed troubled," she admitted finally. "She would spend long hours in her room. She had taken to walking alone, which was not her custom, and there was a letter that came approximately 2 weeks ago, addressed in a hand I did not recognize. When I asked her about it, she became quite evasive." This, Miss Marple reflected as she returned to her chair, was precisely the sort of detail that official investigators often overlooked. A letter, an unknown correspondent, a young woman exhibiting signs of emotional disturbance. The pieces were beginning ever so slightly to suggest a pattern. The afternoon interviews progressed with the methodical efficiency that Detective Inspector gravely brought to all his investigations. Timothy Ashford, the vicar's son, was questioned for approximately 35 minutes and emerged looking somewhat defensive, as though he had been accused of something he wished to deny but found himself unable to do so convincingly. The village postmaster was interviewed next, followed by several of the shopkeepers and tradespeople who might have observed Margaret's movements in recent days. By 3 o'clock, a discernible weariness had settled over the proceedings, as though the investigation itself was becoming exhausted by the weight of its own implications. It was Timothy Ashford's demeanor that particularly caught Miss Marple's attention as she observed him from her position near the vestry window. He sat in the outer hall for nearly 20 minutes after his interview, ostensibly waiting for his father, but actually staring at a point on the wall with such intensity that Miss Marple wondered whether he was seeing the wall at all, or rather some internal landscape of considerable emotional turbulence. When his father finally emerged from the study, the vicar had been interviewed as a matter of routine, given his position in the community. Timothy rose abruptly and hurried toward him with questions that were too urgent, too desperate to be mere social inquiry. Miss Marple excused herself from Mrs. Pemberton's company and made her way toward the church itself, moving with the unhurried grace of someone simply seeking a moment of prayer and reflection. The cool interior of St. Mary's enveloped her like a benediction. She sat in her customary pew, third from the front on the left side, and allowed her mind to organize the information she had gathered thus far into some semblance of coherent pattern. Margaret Henley, A young woman on the cusp of inheriting a substantial fortune had been strangled at the brick well. She had exhibited signs of emotional distress in recent weeks. A mysterious letter had arrived 2 weeks prior. She had taken to solitary walks. She had claimed a headache on the afternoon of the fete, and had therefore ventured out alone rather than attending the festivities. Or so her stepmother had believed. Clara Ashworth had discovered her body. Robert Ashworth, Clara's brother, had shown signs of acute anxiety during his interview. Timothy Ashford, who had once been Margaret's companion at social events, had been questioned for a substantial length of time. The connections were beginning to emerge, though they remained frustratingly incomplete. Miss Marple found herself considering the nature of secrets, the way they accumulated in small villages like snow in winter, layering upon one another until the entire landscape was transformed by their weight. Everyone in Thornfield possessed secrets. Minor transgressions, embarrassing truths, shameful desires, kept carefully hidden behind the facade of respectability. But which secrets, if any, were relevant to murder? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Detective Inspector Gravely himself. He entered the church with the purposeful stride of a man accustomed to moving through the world as though it existed for his convenience rather than the other way around. He genuflected perfunctorily in the direction of the altar, a courtesy to the church rather than to any genuine spiritual inclination, Miss Marple suspected, and then settled himself into the pew directly in front of her own. "Miss Marple," he said without turning around. It was not a question. "Detective Inspector," she replied with equal formality. "I am told you are something of a repository of village knowledge," Gravely continued, still facing forward, "that you have lived here for a considerable time and have observed the interconnections between the various residents." Miss Marple considered her response carefully. She had dealt with police officers before, in her capacity as a concerned citizen and observer of human nature, and she had learned that they were a peculiar breed, simultaneously dismissive of anything that smacked of intuition or observation, and desperately eager to acquire any information that might crack a case. Gravely, she sensed, fell into the latter category. He was intelligent enough to recognize that his formal interviews, while necessary, might be missing crucial context. "I have lived in St. Mary Mead for many years," Miss Marple said finally, "though I confess that Thornfield, while charming, is not my village of origin. I've observed that all small communities contain similar patterns of behavior and motivation. The particulars change, but the essential human dynamics remain remarkably consistent." Gravely turned to face her now, his eyes sharp with interest. "And what patterns do you observe here in Thornfield?" "I observe," Miss Marple said slowly, "that there are several young people whose lives have intersected with Margaret Henley's in ways that suggest emotional investment of varying degrees. I observe that financial matters, while potentially motivating in themselves, often conceal deeper personal grievances. And I observe that at least one person in this village is lying to you about their whereabouts on the afternoon of the fete." "Indeed?" Gravely leaned forward with renewed interest. "And who might that be?" "I cannot say with certainty," Miss Marple replied, which was technically true. "But I would suggest that you pay particular attention to the discrepancies between what people claim they were doing and what their customary habits would suggest. People are creatures of routine, Detective Inspector. When they deviate from their established patterns, particularly in moments of stress, they often reveal more than they intend." Gravely rose to his feet, and Miss Marple observed the faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He had the look of a man whose investigation had just taken a subtle but significant turn toward revelation. By the time evening descended upon Thornfield, Detective Inspector Gravely had redirected his entire investigative approach with the precision of a chess player recognizing a superior position on the board. The formal interviews in the church vestry had concluded, but Gravely remained in the village, ensconced in the vicar's study with his notebook, conducting what appeared to be a series of secondary inquiries. He had sent his young constable to the post office with instructions to examine the postal records for the past month, specifically looking for correspondence addressed to Margaret Henley. He had also dispatched a telegram to London requesting urgent background information on certain residents of Thornfield whose names had begun to assume suspicious prominence in his investigation. Miss Marple, having returned to her cottage for a light supper of soup and bread, found herself the recipient of an unexpected visitor at 6:30. Clara Ashworth appeared at her doorstep with the frantic energy of someone whose internal equilibrium had been fundamentally disrupted. Her usually neat appearance was disheveled, her hair escaping from its pins in multiple directions, and her eyes possessed that particular quality of desperation that came from the collision between truth and its concealment. "May I come in?" Clara asked without preamble, glancing nervously over her shoulder as though pursued by invisible accusers. Miss Marple ushered her inside, with the calm acceptance of someone who had learned long ago that people in distress often sought out the elderly, as though age itself conferred some special immunity to judgment. She settled Clara in her comfortable armchair with a cup of strong tea, and waited with her characteristic patience for whatever revelation the young woman had come to impart. "They know," Clara said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "The inspector knows that I was not at the fete when I said I was. He knows I was somewhere else." "And were you?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Clara's hands trembled as she clutched her teacup. "Yes," she admitted. "I was with Robert, my brother. We were at the old stone bridge near Ashford Farm. We had gone there because we needed to discuss something private, something that had nothing to do with Margaret's death. Yet you felt compelled to lie to the inspector about your whereabouts," Miss Marple observed, not unkindly. "Because it would look suspicious," Clara burst out. "Don't you see? If I tell him I was with Robert, he will think we were conspiring together, and he might think we had something to do with Margaret's death, but we didn't. I swear to you, Miss Marple, we had nothing to do with it." Miss Marple set down her teacup and folded her hands in her lap, with the contemplative demeanor of someone weighing multiple possibilities simultaneously. "Tell me, dear, what was it that you and your brother needed to discuss so privately that you would absent yourselves from the village fete?" Clara's face flushed a deep crimson. For a long moment, she appeared to be struggling with her own resistance to confession. Then, with the surrender of someone who had carried a burden far too heavy for her own strength, she spoke. "Robert has been offered a position," Clara said quietly. "A substantial position, managing a large estate in Derbyshire. It is an extraordinary opportunity for him, the sort of thing that would not come again in his lifetime. But it requires him to leave Thornfield immediately. He has been deliberating for weeks about whether to accept. The letter came the day before the fete, and he finally decided to take it. We were at the stone bridge discussing the practical arrangements, when he would leave, how to inform our parents, what would happen to his land holdings here." "I see," Miss Marple said thoughtfully. "And Margaret Henley, did she know of this decision?" Clara's eyes widened. "How could she? Robert only decided on the day before the fete, unless he told her, but he wouldn't have had any reason to do so. Margaret and Robert were not particularly close. She was my friend, not his." "Were you?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Particularly close, I mean? You and Margaret?" Something flickered across Clara's face, a flash of emotion too complex to be easily categorized. "We were once," she said finally. "We were very close indeed when we were younger, but in recent months things had become strained. There was a disagreement about something that seemed insignificant at the time, but which created a distance between us." "What was this disagreement?" Miss Marple pressed gently. Clara rose from her chair and moved to the window, gazing out into the gathering darkness. "Timothy Ashford," she said at last. "I had developed feelings for him, but Timothy had been spending a great deal of time with Margaret. I confess I felt hurt, and I said some things to Margaret that I later regretted. I implied that she was being deliberately cruel in pursuing Timothy's attentions when she knew how I felt about him. Margaret denied everything, insisted that Timothy's friendship meant nothing to her, but I didn't believe her. We had not truly reconciled before she died. Miss Marple absorbed this revelation with the careful attention it deserved. Here, then, was another layer of motivation, another potential source of resentment. Yet something about Clara's explanation did not quite align with the facts as Miss Marple understood them. Timothy's own behavior suggested that his connection to Margaret had been more substantial than mere casual friendship, and yet Clara seemed to be suggesting that Margaret had minimized her involvement with him. "Thank you for confiding in me, dear," Miss Marple said finally. "I think it would be wise if you were to tell Detective Inspector Gravely the truth about your whereabouts and your reasons for being evasive. The truth, while sometimes uncomfortable, is ultimately far less damaging than the suspicion that accompanies deception." After Clara had departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage, her knitting needles moving in their familiar rhythm, her mind working through the emerging pattern with the persistence of someone assembling a particularly complex puzzle. Somewhere within this tangle of emotions, secret ambitions, and hidden resentments lay the truth of Margaret Henley's death. And Miss Marple was beginning to discern its outline with increasing clarity. The morning after Clara's confession brought with it a subtle shift in the investigative atmosphere. Detective Inspector Gravely, upon receiving Clara's revised account of her whereabouts, had apparently accepted her explanation with the pragmatic understanding that young people often possessed legitimate reasons for discretion. Robert Ashworth had corroborated his sister's story, and the inspector had moved on to what he appeared to consider more promising avenues of inquiry. Yet Miss Marple, observing the village's resumed activities with her customary acuity, sensed that something fundamental had altered in the investigation's trajectory. The post office had yielded its secrets. According to the postmaster, who had mentioned the matter to Mrs. Pemberton, who had subsequently mentioned it to the greengrocer, who had mentioned it to half the village by midday, the mysterious letter that had arrived at the Henley residence 2 weeks prior had been posted from London. The handwriting, while not professionally examined, appeared to belong to someone educated and deliberate in their composition. More intriguingly, there had been a second letter, posted merely 3 days prior to Margaret's death, which had been delivered to the vicar's house rather than to Margaret directly. This letter had been addressed to Timothy Ashford. It was this revelation that prompted Miss Marple to undertake what she considered a necessary intervention. She sent a carefully worded note to Timothy Ashford, expressing her wish to discuss certain matters of village concern and requesting that he call upon her at his earliest convenience. Timothy arrived at her cottage at precisely 2 o'clock in the afternoon, his youthful face bearing the haggard expression of someone who had not slept well in several days. Miss Marple offered him tea, which he refused, and settled him into her most comfortable chair with the maternal courtesy that had disarmed countless troubled souls over her 70-odd years. She did not immediately broach the subject of Margaret Henley or the mysterious correspondence. Instead, she engaged him in what appeared to be idle conversation about his studies at university, his prospects for employment, the weather, and other such innocuous topics. Gradually, almost imperceptibly, she steered the conversation toward the matter of his recent social engagements in Thornfield. "I understand you have been spending considerable time with the young ladies of the village," Miss Marple observed, with the gentle interest of someone merely making polite conversation. Clara Ashworth is a charming girl, and Margaret Henley was, I'm told, quite accomplished in various ways. Timothy's jaw tightened noticeably. Margaret was a complex person, he said finally, each word seeming to require considerable effort. "I imagine she must have been," Miss Marple agreed. "Most people of genuine intelligence and sensitivity are complex, are they not? The simpler people rarely trouble us with their complications. It is the complex ones who often find themselves in difficult situations." Timothy rose abruptly from his chair and moved to the window, his back toward Miss Marple. When he spoke, his voice was barely audible. "She was being threatened," he said. "Margaret was being threatened by someone, and she didn't know what to do." Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their rhythmic motion without interruption, though her entire attention was now focused upon the young man before her. "Threatened in what manner?" she asked gently. "Letters," Timothy said, turning to face her with anguished eyes. "The letter that arrived 2 weeks ago contained allegations of a deeply personal nature. Someone was accusing Margaret of improper conduct. It was completely unfounded, a vicious lie, but the writer threatened to make these allegations public unless Margaret paid a sum of money. £500. It was blackmail, Miss Marple. Pure and simple blackmail." "And did Margaret inform anyone of this threat?" Miss Marple inquired. "She told me," Timothy admitted. "Because the threat included references to my own family, implied that our association had been improper. She was frantic with worry. She asked my advice about whether she should tell her stepmother or go to the police. I encouraged her toward the latter course. But Margaret was terrified of scandal, of what people would say. She was going to pay the money. She said she would withdraw it from her personal accounts and arrange payment." Miss Marple set down her knitting with deliberate care. "And then she died before the payment could be made." "Yes," Timothy said, his voice breaking slightly. "She sent me a letter, you see, the one that was delivered to the vicar's house. She told me that she had decided to confront the blackmailer directly, to demand to know the truth of the allegations, to understand why she had been targeted. I begged her not to do so, but Margaret could be remarkably stubborn. She said she was going to meet the person at the brick well because it was isolated, and she thought it would be safer to have a conversation in a place where they would not be observed. I told her she was mad, that it was far too dangerous, but she wouldn't listen." "And you did not attempt to prevent her from keeping this appointment?" Miss Marple asked, though her tone suggested she already suspected the answer. "I wanted to," Timothy said miserably. "But I was a coward. I was frightened of becoming further entangled in the matter, frightened of what my father would think if he learned of my association with someone involved in such sordid circumstances. I told myself that Margaret was intelligent enough to manage the situation, that she would extract herself from the difficulty. Instead, she walked directly into her own destruction." The weight of Timothy's guilt hung in the air between them like a physical presence. Miss Marple regarded him with a mixture of compassion and clarity that characterized her approach to human frailty. "You must tell Detective Inspector Gravely everything you have just told me," she said. "Immediately. This information fundamentally alters the nature of the investigation. Someone in this village was engaged in blackmail, Timothy, and that someone, almost certainly, is responsible for Margaret Henley's death." Timothy's confession transformed the investigation with the force of a thunderclap, breaking through summer stillness. Detective Inspector Gravely, upon receiving this revelation, immediately prioritized the identification of the blackmailer. The letters themselves became the primary focus of forensic examination. The handwriting, though deliberately disguised, possessed certain characteristics that might prove identifiable under rigorous analysis. The paper was common enough, purchased from any number of suppliers, but the typeface used for certain portions of the text suggested access to a specific printing press or typewriter. By late afternoon, Gravely had expanded his inquiry to encompass the professional and commercial establishments of Thornfield. He visited the solicitor's office, where Robert Ashworth had worked prior to his imminent departure for Derbyshire. He examined the typewriters in the post office, the printing press in the newspaper office, housed in the adjoining village of Ashford Mills. He interviewed the school teacher about her access to writing materials, and the vicar about the church's correspondence equipment. Each inquiry was conducted with meticulous attention. Each suspect was examined not for the act of murder itself, but for the capacity and opportunity to have composed the threatening letters. It was during this process that Miss Marple made a discreet observation to Gravely regarding the nature of blackmail as a crime. They encountered one another in the village street at approximately 4 o'clock, and she remarked, with apparent casualness, that blackmailers were often motivated by far more than simple financial gain. The money itself, she suggested, frequently served as merely a pretext for the exercise of power, for the satisfaction of inflicting psychological torment upon a victim. In her experience, blackmailers were frequently people of modest means who harbored considerable resentment toward those they perceived as privileged or fortunate. Gravely regarded her with renewed interest at this observation. "You suggest, then, that the blackmailer might have known Margaret Henley personally, that there existed some prior relationship marked by grievance?" "I suggest only what the evidence itself suggests," Miss Marple replied modestly. "Though I confess that the specificity of the allegations contained in the letters does imply familiarity with Margaret's personal circumstances. One does not fabricate scandals about strangers. One fabricates them about people whose lives one has observed closely, whose vulnerabilities one understands." That evening, as Thornfield's residents prepared their suppers and settled into the uneasy rhythm of a village living under investigative scrutiny, Detective Inspector Gravely returned to the vicar's study with new purpose. He had discovered something in the newspaper office, evidence of a typewriter with a distinctive flaw in its lettering, a misalignment that would produce a characteristic mark upon any document typed upon it. The letters received by Margaret Henley bore precisely this mark. The typewriter in question belonged to the newspaper office, but more significantly, it was regularly used by anyone in the village with legitimate business requiring typed correspondence. The vicar used it for his official letters. The solicitor used it for certain documents. And Venetia Henley, who served as secretary for the village charitable committee, used it frequently for her administrative work. It was this last revelation that caused Gravely to summon Venetia for a supplementary interview at 7:30 in the evening. Miss Marple, who had positioned herself strategically near the church with the excuse of attending evening prayers, observed Venetia's arrival with the calm attentiveness of someone watching pieces fall into place upon a board. The widow moved with considerably less composure than she had exhibited during her initial questioning. Her hands trembled, and there was a quality of hunted desperation in her eyes that suggested she understood that her position had become considerably more precarious. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. Village residents passing near the church reported hearing raised voices, though the words themselves remained indistinct. At one point, Mrs. Pemberton brought tea to the study, but emerged moments later with the clear impression that her assistance was not welcome. When Venetia finally departed at 9:30, she was accompanied by Gravely himself, who appeared to be conducting a walkthrough of relevant locations with her as his guide. They proceeded directly toward the brick well, taking the winding path through the elm grove that had become familiar to the village through repeated journeys during the investigation. Miss Marple, observing from a discreet distance, followed at what she considered an appropriate interval. What she anticipated was not a full confession, but rather a reconstruction of events, an attempt by Gravely to compel Venetia to articulate her movements and motivations in the location where Margaret Henley had met her death. They remained at the brick well for approximately 15 minutes. Miss Marple, positioning herself behind a substantial elm tree, observed the detective's body language with the practiced eye of someone who had learned to read human intention through gesture and posture. Gravely was gesticulating emphatically, apparently asking Venetia to demonstrate or describe specific actions. Venetia's responses appeared to be reluctant, minimal, resistant. But then, as Miss Marple watched with her characteristic patience, something shifted. Venetia's entire posture collapsed inward. Her hands rose to her face. Her shoulders shook with what appeared to be the violent onset of emotional breakdown. Gravely, rather than offering comfort, simply stood observing her with the detached professionalism of someone witnessing the disintegration of a carefully constructed facade. When they returned to the village, Venetia Henley was no longer walking as a free woman making an involuntary statement to police. She was walking as a suspect in custody. Her future now contingent upon the mercy of the legal system and the judgment of 12 ordinary people who would be required to determine whether she had indeed committed the murder, for which evidence was rapidly accumulating against her. The arrest of Venetia Henley sent through Thornfield a shockwave of profound proportions. By the following morning, every resident of the village had absorbed the essential facts. Margaret's stepmother had been taken into custody on suspicion of murder. The blackmail letters had originated from her typewriter. Her movements on the afternoon of the fete could not be adequately accounted for. Most damning of all, preliminary examination of the study in the Henley residence had revealed a draft of one of the threatening letters, incomplete and bearing Venetia's distinctive handwriting beneath the typed portions. Yet as Miss Marple sat in her cottage on the morning after the arrest, sipping her morning tea and perusing the local newspaper's dramatic account of the developments, she found herself possessed of a troubling uncertainty. The evidence against Venetia was substantial, certainly, and Gravely seemed satisfied that his investigation had reached its proper conclusion. And yet something in the narrative as it had unfolded continued to nag at Miss Marple's consciousness, like an unresolved discordance in music. She considered the established facts methodically. Venetia had been blackmailing Margaret, her own stepdaughter. The motive appeared to be financial. Venetia's own circumstances, while comfortable, were not lavish, and Margaret's impending inheritance represented a significant concentration of wealth that would soon pass beyond her stepmother's control. Upon Margaret's death, the estate would revert to Venetia as trustee until such time as Margaret reached an age that was now forever impossible. Technically, Venetia would possess access to and control over Margaret's substantial inheritance for the remainder of her own life. This logic was persuasive. It was also, Miss Marple reflected, almost too persuasive. It accounted for all the obvious motives and explained the apparent evidence with almost suspicious neatness. And there remained that small but persistent inconsistency that had troubled Miss Marple from the beginning, the detail that had stood slightly apart from the general flow of events like a note struck slightly out of tune. The girl seen at the brick well. This was what occupied Miss Marple's thoughts as she composed a careful note requesting that Detective Inspector Gravely visit her at his earliest convenience. Clara Ashworth had been the person to discover Margaret's body, but had Clara been the only person at the brick well that afternoon? Had anyone observed Clara arriving, departing? Had anyone noted her emotional state or the precise timing of her arrival? Gravely appeared at Miss Marple's cottage at mid-morning, his expression suggesting a man who had achieved professional satisfaction and expected nothing more than to collect the congratulations of grateful residents. He settled himself in her sitting room with the air of someone granting an audience rather than seeking counsel. "I understand you wish to speak with me," Gravely said, his tone not unkind but decidedly perfunctory. "I wished merely to clarify certain matters," Miss Marple replied. "Matters which may or may not bear upon your investigation. I confess I've been troubled by certain aspects of the evidence as it has been presented." Gravely's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. "Miss Marple, while I appreciate your keen observation and the assistance you have already provided, I think it fair to say that the case against Mrs. Venetia Henley is substantially established. The forensic evidence, the motive, the opportunity, all point conclusively toward her guilt." "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed, "and yet I wonder whether you have fully considered the timing of events on the afternoon in question. Margaret claimed a headache and did not attend the fete. Her stepmother has stated that Margaret departed the house at approximately 2:15 in the afternoon. Clara Ashworth has stated that she discovered the body at approximately 3:30. This leaves a window of merely 75 minutes. Sufficient time for Mrs. Henley to have traveled to the brick well, confronted her stepdaughter, and committed murder," Gravely observed. "Sufficient time, certainly," Miss Marple acknowledged. But I confess I am troubled by the question of how Mrs. Henley knew that Margaret would be at the brick well. According to Timothy Ashford's statement, Margaret did not communicate her intention to confront the blackmailer until she had already written to him. The letter that was delivered to Timothy's address at the vicar's house would not have been received until after Margaret had already departed her own residence. Gravely leaned back in his chair, his expression becoming more guarded. Mrs. Henley claims that Margaret told her of her intention to meet someone that afternoon, though she did not specify the location. Does she indeed? Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. And yet Mrs. Henley has been accused of writing letters in which she demonstrated detailed knowledge of Margaret's personal circumstances and vulnerabilities. If she possessed such knowledge, surely she would have foreseen that Margaret might attempt to confront her blackmailer directly. But to know this and to arrange to be at the brick well at precisely the moment Margaret arrived, this would require either extraordinary coincidence or prior knowledge of Margaret's specific intentions. You are suggesting that someone else informed Mrs. Henley of Margaret's plans? Gravely asked, his tone suggesting skepticism. I am suggesting only that the evidence, while superficially compelling, may not be entirely what it appears, Miss Marple replied carefully. I would be very interested to know whether anyone observed Mrs. Henley departing from her residence on the afternoon in question, whether her clothing bore any marks or stains consistent with violent struggle, whether she possessed any scratches or defensive wounds upon her person. Gravely's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. The physician's examination did not reveal any such injuries, he admitted finally. Curious, Miss Marple mused. Margaret Henley was strangled, was she not? Such an intimate form of violence, requiring close physical contact. One would anticipate that the victim might have defended herself, might have inflicted scratches or other injuries upon her attacker, yet you have just informed me that Mrs. Henley bore no such marks. The silence that followed this observation was pregnant with implication. Gravely rose abruptly from his chair, his expression darkening. You are suggesting that I have made an error in my investigation, he demanded. I am suggesting only that you may have arrived at your conclusion with somewhat more haste than thoroughness would warrant, Miss Marple said gently. Margaret Henley's murderer remains at large, Detective Inspector, and I fear that by focusing upon the wrong suspect, you may have allowed the true perpetrator to move beyond the reach of justice. Detective Inspector Gravely's departure from Miss Marple's cottage was marked by a quality of restrained fury that suggested her observations had struck deeper than she had perhaps anticipated. He drove directly to the police station where Venetia Henley remained in custody, and within the hour had ordered her release pending further investigation. The reversal of fortune was dramatic and complete. Venetia emerged from custody with the dazed expression of someone who had anticipated imminent trial and conviction, and now found herself unexpectedly returned to uncertain liberty. The news of the arrest's reversal rippled through Thornfield with the force of an earthquake, destabilizing the provisional narratives that residents had constructed to make sense of Margaret's death. If Venetia Henley had not committed the murder, then who had? The question that residents had believed answered reopened itself with renewed and troubling urgency. Gravely, to his credit, refocused his investigation with renewed intensity. He re-examined the physical evidence at the brick well. He conducted supplementary interviews with all parties who had been anywhere near the site on the afternoon of the fete. He requested that the postal authorities provide detailed records of all correspondence sent by residents of Thornfield in the preceding weeks. It was during this reinvigorated investigation that a critical discovery emerged. The typewriter in the newspaper office, upon closer forensic examination, revealed traces of correction fluid, the sort used to cover typing errors. Beneath the correction fluid, when carefully examined under magnification, were fragments of another letter. This letter, partially preserved and painstakingly reconstructed by Gravely's forensic expert from London, contained phrasing and accusations identical to those in the blackmail letters sent to Margaret. But this draft letter had been written by two different hands. The typed portions had been composed by one person, the handwritten annotations and revisions by another entirely. This discovery prompted an entirely new direction of inquiry. Gravely began examining the movements and relationships of all those with regular access to the newspaper office. The editor, the printer's assistant, the school teacher who occasionally used the premises for administrative work. And among these ordinary residents of Thornfield, a pattern began to emerge that had previously gone unnoticed. Robert Ashworth, in his capacity as land manager for several village properties, had occasion to visit the newspaper office. More significantly, Clara Ashworth, serving on the village charitable committee alongside Venetia Henley, had also been a frequent visitor. Miss Marple, who had been observing Gravely's investigative progress with her customary attentiveness, found herself increasingly focused upon Clara. There was something in the young woman's behavior since her initial false statement about her whereabouts that suggested emotional turmoil of considerable magnitude. She had become withdrawn, spending long hours alone. She had ceased attending social gatherings. Most tellingly, she had made inquiries at the solicitor's office regarding the possibility of traveling abroad, apparently seeking information about passport documentation and the procedures for emigration. It was this last detail that prompted Miss Marple to arrange a final interview with Clara at her cottage. The young woman arrived on a grey afternoon when mist hung low over Thornfield, lending the village an atmosphere of isolation and disconnection from the ordinary world. Clara appeared diminished somehow, as though the weight of hidden knowledge had physically compressed her frame. She accepted Miss Marple's offer of tea with trembling hands and settled into the familiar armchair with the bearing of someone approaching confession. "I did not kill Margaret," Clara said without preamble, her voice barely above a whisper. "You must understand that, Miss Marple. I did not kill her." "I did not suggest that you had," Miss Marple replied gently, "though I confess I've been troubled by certain aspects of your behavior since Margaret's death. Your anxiety, your sudden interest in emigration, your apparent emotional distress. These things suggest that you possess knowledge you have not yet shared with the authorities." Clara's eyes filled with tears. "Robert needed money," she said finally. "Our father is not a wealthy man, and Robert's prospects here in Thornfield were limited. When he received the offer from Derbyshire, it represented an opportunity that would never come again. But the position required funds as a form of bond, a demonstration of good faith and financial stability. Robert did not possess such funds." "And Margaret Henley possessed them," Miss Marple said, understanding beginning to crystallize. "Robert had helped her stepmother with various estate matters," Clara continued, her words tumbling out in a rush of long-suppressed confession. "He had access to Margaret's personal correspondence. He discovered that she received substantial quarterly payments from an investment trust. He realized that Margaret, despite her youth, possessed considerable independent resources. He conceived the idea of the blackmail scheme as a means of acquiring the funds he needed. I did not initially know what he intended. He only confided in me after the letters had already been sent." "And you remonstrated with him?" Miss Marple prompted. "I was horrified," Clara said passionately. "I begged him to abandon the scheme. I told him it was wicked, that it would destroy Margaret, that it would inevitably lead to discovery and ruin. But Robert was desperate, Miss Marple. He was convinced that this was his only opportunity to escape the limitations of his life here. He promised me that Margaret would pay the money, that no real harm would come to her, that it was merely a temporary matter, and that he would repay every penny once he had established himself in Derbyshire. But Margaret did not simply pay the money," Miss Marple observed. "She decided to confront the blackmailer." "Robert went to the brick well to meet her," Clara said, her voice breaking. "He intended only to explain himself, to negotiate some other arrangement. He did not go there planning violence. But Margaret was furious, betrayed by someone she had considered a friend. She threatened to go to the police immediately. She said she would ensure that Robert was prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. Robert panicked. He said he only meant to restrain her, to prevent her from running away, to have time to convince her to remain silent. But in the struggle, he lost control. His hands closed around her throat, and by the time he comprehended what he was doing, it was too late. The confession hung in the air between them, terrible and final. Clara buried her face in her hands, her entire body shaking with the violence of her sobs. Miss Marple rose with the careful deliberation of age and placed a gentle hand upon the young woman's shoulder. "You must tell Detective Inspector Gravely everything you have just told me," Miss Marple said. "The truth, however painful, is ultimately more merciful than continued deception." Clara's confession, communicated to Detective Inspector Gravely within the hour, initiated a series of events that unfolded with the inexorable momentum of a narrative reaching its climax. Gravely, armed now with specific knowledge of the true perpetrator's identity, conducted a thorough search of Robert Ashworth's residence and discovered among his personal effects a handkerchief bearing traces of Margaret Henley's blood. In a locked drawer in his study, they found the draft letters, the financial calculations meticulously documenting the amount he required, and most damning of all, a journal entry dated the afternoon of Margaret's death, composed in what appeared to be a state of profound psychological disturbance and containing a fragmented account of the events at the Brick Well. Robert Ashworth was apprehended at the railway station in the neighboring county of Surrey, where he had apparently intended to board a train to the coast with the intention of securing passage aboard a vessel bound for the Americas. He offered no resistance to arrest, his earlier desperation having transformed into a kind of numb resignation. The young man who had seemed destined for a prosperous future in Derbyshire now faced trial for murder, his carefully constructed escape route rendered irrelevant by the machinery of justice that he had attempted to evade. Yet even with the murderer identified and apprehended, the village of Thornfield did not experience the simple catharsis that might have been anticipated from the resolution of such a terrible crime. Instead, there descended upon the community a more complex emotional landscape, one marked by the troubling recognition that ordinary people one had known since childhood, were capable of extraordinary darkness. Robert Ashworth, who had been regarded as a steady, reliable member of the community, stood revealed as a man capable of violence born from desperation and pride. The blackmail scheme itself suggested a profound moral degradation, a willingness to inflict psychological torment upon someone vulnerable in exchange for personal advancement. Miss Marple received visitors throughout the day following Robert's arrest. Mrs. Pemberton came to thank her for her investigative efforts and to speculate, with barely concealed prurience, about the psychological factors that might have led to such depravity. The vicar himself called, expressing his pastoral concern for all parties involved, not merely the victim and her family, but also Clara and Robert, who were themselves victims of circumstance and human weakness. Even Detective Inspector Gravely made a final call, ostensibly to clarify certain details of Miss Marple's investigative reasoning, but actually, she suspected, to acknowledge in his own grudging fashion that her insights had proved more valuable than his formal methodology. It was during this final interview that Gravely made an observation that seemed to Miss Marple to contain the seeds of a larger truth. "You knew," he said, settling into a familiar armchair with the ease of someone who had become accustomed to its contours through repeated visits. "From relatively early in the investigation, you suspected that the obvious suspect was not the true perpetrator. How did you discern this when all the evidence pointed toward Venetia Henley?" Miss Marple considered the question with her characteristic care. "I did not know with certainty," she replied. "I suspected only. You see, Detective Inspector, in my experience, the most apparently perfect suspects are often the least likely perpetrators. People frequently construct their guilt with such obvious intention that it becomes apparent to any observer that they are being deliberately theatrical. But genuine murderers, particularly those motivated by desperation rather than premeditation, often commit their crimes with a kind of psychological blindness. They do not think to construct elaborate defenses because they have not fully acknowledged to themselves that they have committed murder at all. And in this case, Gravely prompted, In this case, Miss Marple said, I was troubled by Mrs. Henley's own behavior. A woman engaged in blackmail, a woman motivated by financial gain, would logically move to secure her victim's wealth through murder only as a last resort. But Venetia's emotions seemed to me excessive for a woman merely protecting her financial interests. She exhibited anger, certainly, but also a kind of resignation, as though she had already accepted that her circumstances would inevitably worsen. By contrast, I observed in certain other residents a quality of barely suppressed panic, a sense that events were spiraling beyond their capacity to control them. This quality, in my experience, typically accompanies genuine criminal desperation rather than calculated premeditation. Gravely nodded slowly, as though absorbing wisdom he had not previously possessed. Your observations regarding the lack of defensive wounds on Mrs. Henley's person were particularly incisive, he acknowledged. That detail, more than any other, suggested that we had pursued the wrong line of inquiry. It was a small thing, Miss Marple said modestly. But small things, in my experience, often contain the most significant truths. Margaret Henley's killer would necessarily have been marked by the struggle, would necessarily have borne evidence of her final resistance. A careful examination of all suspects would have revealed this discrepancy far earlier than it did. I merely articulated what the evidence itself was attempting to communicate. After Gravely's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage as evening descended upon Thornfield. The village had survived its crisis, though not without profound alteration to its collective consciousness. The comfortable illusions of safety and predictability had been shattered, replaced by a more complex understanding of human nature and its capacity for moral failure. Yet this, Miss Marple reflected, was perhaps the inevitable cost of living in community with others, the gradual recognition that all people were capable of darkness, and that civilization itself was merely a thin veneer overlaying depths of potential violence and despair. She picked up her knitting, resuming the gentle rhythm that had accompanied her thoughts throughout the investigation. The pattern was nearly complete now, and soon she would have finished the cardigan she had begun so many weeks ago. In the completion of small domestic tasks, she found a quiet affirmation of order and continuity. Life would proceed in Thornfield. People would recover. Time would eventually transform this terrible event into historical memory. And Miss Marple, as always, would remain, observing and understanding the endless variations of human weakness and strength that constituted the genuine substance of village life. The trial of Robert Ashworth took place in the county courthouse 3 months after Margaret Henley's death, by which time Thornfield had settled into a new equilibrium marked by subdued normalcy and underlying unease. The proceedings were conducted with the formal precision that characterized English justice. Each piece of evidence methodically presented, each witness carefully examined and cross-examined. Robert himself maintained a demeanor of quiet resignation throughout, offering no defense beyond a plea of guilty to the charge of manslaughter rather than murder, a distinction that his solicitor argued was justified by the absence of premeditation in the final violent act. The jury, composed of 12 ordinary men drawn from the surrounding counties, listened to the arguments with the solemn attentiveness appropriate to a case involving the taking of human life. The prosecution presented their evidence with meticulous care. The typewriter correspondence, the draft letters bearing 2 distinct hands, the blood-stained handkerchief, and most powerfully, Robert's own journal entry describing in fragmentary terms the horror of that final moment when desperation transformed into violence. Clara Ashworth testified with visible emotional distress, her words sometimes barely audible as she recounted her brother's confession and her own anguished knowledge of his crime. Miss Marple attended the trial on its final day, sitting in the public gallery with the quiet dignity that characterized her presence in all public spaces. She observed Robert in the dock with the compassionate clarity that had become her trademark, seeing in the young man's face not merely the murderer he had proven to be, but also the desperate, frightened boy who had allowed ambition and desperation to override his moral judgment. The verdict, when it came after only 3 hours of deliberation, was guilty of manslaughter. The sentence was 15 years' imprisonment, a judgment that seemed to satisfy neither the demands of justice nor the expectations of mercy. In the weeks following the trial, Thornfield underwent a subtle but significant transformation. The scandal had attracted the attention of the London newspapers, and for a brief period, journalists descended upon the village with their characteristic appetite for sensational detail and human interest narratives. They interviewed residents, examined the brick well with theatrical solemnity, and constructed elaborate theories about the psychological factors that had contributed to Robert's moral collapse. But gradually, as newspapers turned their attention to other crimes and other villages, Thornfield returned to its customary quiet. It was on a grey afternoon in late autumn, nearly 5 months after Margaret's death, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Clara Ashworth appeared at her cottage door with considerably greater composure than she had displayed during their previous encounters, though her eyes still carried traces of the emotional ordeal that had defined her recent months. She had come, she explained, to bid farewell. She was departing Thornfield the following week, accepting a position as a companion to an elderly widow in Cornwall. She could no longer remain in the village where so much tragedy had accumulated, where every familiar street seemed to carry the weight of terrible memory. Miss Marple offered tea and listened as Clara spoke of her plans, her fears, her tentative hopes for some measure of renewal in a new location. The younger woman seemed diminished by her experience, yet also somehow clarified, as though the terrible events had burned away the uncertainties of youth and left behind a more concentrated sense of self. She asked Miss Marple directly whether she believed Robert had truly intended to kill Margaret, or whether the violence had been, as he claimed, an act of desperate panic rather than calculated murder. "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Robert intended something far less violent than what actually occurred. I believe he went to that meeting hoping to persuade Margaret through explanation and appeal, but I also believe that he had already crossed a moral threshold through the act of blackmail itself. Once a person has accepted that they are willing to inflict psychological torment upon another human being, the step toward physical violence becomes considerably less formidable. The boundary between blackmail and murder is less absolute than it might appear to the untrained observer." Clara absorbed this observation in silence for several moments. "Do you think Robert is evil?" she asked finally, "or merely weak?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, "that most human beings contain within themselves the capacity for both great strength and considerable weakness, depending upon the circumstances that confront them and the choices they make in response to those circumstances. Your brother made choices that led him toward darkness. Others, facing similar desperation, might have chosen differently. But equally, I suspect that if I had known Robert's true inner struggles, his genuine fears about his future, his sense of being trapped by the limitations of his circumstances, I might have felt considerable sympathy for him even before the tragedy occurred." After Clara's departure, Miss Marple sat alone in her cottage as the afternoon light faded into evening. The case was closed, the murderer imprisoned, justice, or at least its formal representation, had been accomplished. Yet the village had not returned to its previous state of innocence. That innocence, once shattered, could never be fully restored. The residents of Thornfield would continue their daily lives, would raise their children, would celebrate their festivals and mourn their losses, but they would do so with the permanent knowledge that ordinary people were capable of extraordinary darkness. Miss Marple picked up her completed cardigan, regarding it with the satisfaction of someone who had brought a project to successful conclusion. The pattern was intricate, the stitching precise, the final product a testament to patience and careful attention to detail. In many ways, she reflected, solving a murder was not unlike completing a piece of needlework. One observed the individual threads, understood how they connected, recognized the pattern that emerged when all elements were properly aligned. The essential skill lay not in dramatic revelation, but in patient, meticulous observation of the small details that others overlooked. As darkness fell over Thornfield, Miss Marple folded her needlework and set it aside. Tomorrow would bring new gossip, new complications, new opportunities to observe the endless variations of human behavior that constituted the genuine substance of village life. But for tonight, she would rest, secure in the knowledge that she had served justice and that the truth, however painful, had ultimately prevailed over deception.